Hi, Misha here, and not really much new, but this is a favorite of mine. Maybe my very favorite of the Preban guns, certainly of 9mm, and a gun, at least the style, that got me to kind of change my mind about open to closed bolt conversions and with sticky yaddy barrels. This is the British Sterling Mark 6, sometimes called the police carbine, a semi-automatic only, civilian legal version, 9x19 Parabellum Luger NATO. That was imported for relatively brief time in relatively small numbers in the 1980s and is based on the British military's L2A3, which Sterling called in their own corporate documentation the Sterling Mark 4. So we'll go into that, of course, but mostly it's just a gun I really enjoy and want to take it out, dust it off, run a few rounds through it, and talk about one of my favorites and some cool features. Simplicity is good. As always, if you could, please do like, share, and subscribe. Like to help us more, check out Patreon. With that, let's see if she still shoots. Alrighty, Sterling. Alright, well, you get me on the porch here for a little bit more added content. Why not? We've run out of daylight, and this is not a Sterling, but it is Britain's latest and greatest rifle. They really wasn't even in full service when the Second World War kicked off for them. The Lee-Enfield No. 4 Mark I, bolt action, 10-shot 303. But in Britain's position, a submachine gun was vital. Now, they bought some Thompsons from America, and they tried producing a version of the Bergman, the MP28, that would actually be at Sterling, the Lanchester. And while they would make a good number, it was just too time-consuming for war. This would lead to the very famous Sten gun, with the Sten Mark II being the most famous and produced version. The Sten was the right gun for the time in Britain. However, it had several shortcomings. It was very cheap and fast to produce. It gave effectively a machine gun to anyone. It fired the ubiquitous 9x19. Keep in mind that in addition to a bolt-action rifle, Britain's standard service sidearm was the revolver, be it a Webley or an Enfield. So yeah, it was a leap forward, but it wasn't the best in terms of safety. Its mags weren't the most reliable, easy to load. So there were efforts underway to replace it by 1944. And that's how we get into the Sterling, or as it was originally known, the Patchet, named for its inventor, Terry Patchet. Wait, that's not right. By the way, I love how bayonets go on these. They're just fun. Now, George William Patchet was the designer at Sterling, who submitted what would become the Patchet Mark I for trials in 1944. It went up against several other designs, and it was purchased in very small numbers, 100, 120, in 1944 for testing. There's talk about it having been used in Operation Market Garden. Other sources say no, it wasn't, and actively in the field. Either way, it was just kind of there for the end of the Second World War. But it seemed poised to replace the Sten. Now, there was an effort known as the Sten Mark V to make a nicer Sten, but the soldiers weren't really happy. They could tell they were kind of putting lipstick on a pig. It had a pistol grip. It had a wooden shoulder stock. It even had a front end that looked like this Enfield here, including taking this bayonet. But it just wasn't enough. It still didn't address a lot of the fundamental problems. But the Patchet did. It had a lot of neat features that really would make it a step forward from just about everything that would come before. just one problem. Post-war, there were a lot of budget cuts, especially in defense spending. And even though there would be additional trials and testing in 1946-47, it was decided that for the time, Britain had enough Stens, and it just was not needed. How did the Sterling get adopted and have such a long, illustrious service life? Well, the Korean War. Governments changed again, and in 1951, after more testing and trials, it was decided, yeah, they were going to adopt what was at the time known as the Patchet Mark II. It would become the L2A1. And it had a few improvements over the World War II era gun, namely a new type of magazine. The original Patchet used Sten or Lanchester mags, but George William himself would design this here because really one of the biggest drawbacks was the Sten's magazine. So a better mag makes a better submachine gun.
Already.
The mag is an interesting thing. This is actually, I believe, an Aussie pouch. You know, Sten pouches will work. In fact, that's what they settle in this capacity. Again, kind of taking from the lessons learned from the old Sten gun. We have a curved mag, double feed on top, whereas the Sten was single. But these have dual rollers in your follower. Those are not bullets. Those are part of the mag. These are extremely easy to load, unload, get in the gun. It's the Rolls Royce of magazines. There are a few variants. There's some made by the British government. They're slightly different. There's, of course, the ones made by Sterling. And, of course, you have copies made overseas, like with the Canadian C1. But no, the mag is really one of the highlights for feeding and function and just being nice. Of course, no bolt hold open because it's not a machine gun, but yeah. While the L2A1 was decided upon in 1951, it did not actually start to go into full production at Sterling until 1953 and thus service. In 1955, Sterling would introduce the Mark III, known as the L2A2, is a very slightly product improved version, and then just a year later, 56, the Mark IV, the definitive version, would be selected as the L2A3, and that's pretty much what we have here. They refined the front sight protector a bit, they reworked the rear sling swivel, and they actually tinkered with the buttstock just a bit. You know, just little things that they had learned after real world use and all that. And then production would ramp up from that. The stock is one of those good and bads. I know what they were going for. After what you had with the Sten gun, they wanted a stock that was going to, not be problematic. Well, they were kind of half right. The butt plate deploys, and you can do it any way you want. Fold it around here, and then you don't just push in your end cap. There's a button under here that also doubles as your takedown. You really need 3 hands. It locks your stock in place. So there's a lot to it, but they weren't expecting people to quickly deploy it, everything. The idea was you have a stock that can fold for transport, but when deployed is rock solid and is pretty much as comfortable as a fixed stock. I mean, this butt plate is nicely rounded, quite thick. Cheek weld is fine. You have a nice curved surface. It is very sturdy, and that's what they valued over quick deployment. Sights are set to 100 and 200 yards, because Britain back in the day. Hooded front post. You have hand stops here. You have the spiral cuts in your bolt to kind of clear sand mud, snow maybe. Interestingly, the L1A1 had them as well. And you have a bayonet lug that's offset that took a modified, essentially the same, but a modified version of Jungle Carbine bayonet. Typically the Sterling ones had black grips. And of course a side-fed magazine, kind of carried over from the Sten. The idea was you can lay prone, use your offhand to change out mags, you know. And of course it has this crinkle finish. Fun fact, the ones made by Fazakerly for the British government only, they just had a phosphate with maybe sunk rat finish. But the ones actually made by Sterling, nah, they got the fancy finish. And then finally, because this is the police version, it has a 16-inch barrel for the U.S. market. And to cover the sticky yaddy barrel, I put a shroud on years ago from E&L that matches, I think. Kind of gives it that L34A1 Mark V look. And they have surprisingly nice triggers. Safety. Safety works. Sterling Company would make the L2A3, of course, and market it. It was their design. And for government use, the Royal Arsenal at Fazakerly would make them as well. Those would be the two primary makers. In 1958, Canada, the Long Branch, but now Canadian Small Arms Limited, would make a greatly simplified version known as the C1. The Sterling really did improve upon the Sten. It was a safer gun, had a better drop safety, also had safeties for handling. It had a true folding stock, whereas the Sten just had a removable stock if it had anything at all. Better, more ergonomic controls, including the pistol grip. Better sights, adjustable but not overly much. But it was more expensive, even though it was solidly a stamped Generation 7 machine gun, tube gun. For what it was very much a product of peacetime, and the Canadians did simplify it using more stampings, less castings, forgings, that kind of thing. Makes sense. India would make an unlicensed copy as the 1A1 and updated it as the 2A1 as well. And then around 1967-68, Sterling would unveil the first production suppressed version, the Mark V, which was adopted as the L34A1. It's limited but pronounced use by the British, but also Australia and New Zealand forces fighting in the Far East and whatnot. So it was a pretty good success for them. The sling is a simple affair, really more or less copied from the Sten, just late style with the kind of alligator clip on the end. There's a few variants. It's adjustable, quite long. Kind of has a QD back here. You can slide it through there to quickly get it off the rear. Not much to say about it, but it works. It comes in a few colors. The safety is large and easy to use. As I already mentioned, the trigger is quite nice. Some of these had so-called turrets on top to actually mount a scope, but others didn't. There are a few variations in the imports. And of course, you can't really talk about the Sterling without its claim to fame. When you fold up your butt plate, it does act as a kind of horizontal forearm, and it does lock in, but you need to make sure you get it in the right area. Yeah, so like this, it should remind you of something. How about now? Yeah, I'm sure you know, this was what was used in Star Wars for the Stormtrooper, the E11, the Blaztech, if you will. They basically put a flush fit mag and a bunch of gobbledygook, especially in the newer films. And later on, like in Return of the Jedi, they actually used resin cast versions. And then in newer films, instead of using actual Sterlings, they used airsoft. But nevertheless, this was the basis of the E11 and even the DH-17 and other guns of Star Wars. So, and the reason why is simple. Star Wars was originally filmed primarily based out of the UK, and they were very much available in 1976, thereabouts. And so, I don't know, kind of sticks it in pop culture, not to mention its nearly half-century of use, being used by dozens upon dozens of nations, and produced in the hundreds and hundreds of thousands. Not to mention, it's just a fun little light shooting gun, and one you don't, think of much. And we'll try it this way, why not? It was good enough for the stormtroopers. One variant I would want to mention briefly, and I wish I still had to show you. When I picked this one up, I bought it as a pair. This Carbine, the Mark 6, and the Mark 7 quote-unquote para pistol. And there was a select fire version known as the Mark 7 as well, introduced around 1982-83 for security forces, plainclothes police, special forces in the military. Ironically, not really maybe paratroopers. Essentially, it had no shoulder stock, and this part of the tube was the same, but they would cut down the tube here, whereas the standard version had a 7.7, 7.8 inch barrel. This one doesn't. This is 16. It's legal. The para would have a much shorter 4.5, so they would cut the tube off and have a cap. And I had it. It also had a compact 15 round magazine. Yeah. But I don't know how successful it was. I really don't. At the same time, I don't know how many were sold in general, because Sterling as a company, despite their best efforts, including the AR-18, AR-180, would be out of business by 1988. Yeah, even before the ban came down in 1989 on imports, they were already gone. So what do you do? Nevertheless, in their wake, Sterling themselves produced over 400,000 of these. That's not counting nearly as many built in Canada, an unknown number in India, so on and so forth. I just wanted to mention the Mark 7. It's one of the guns kind of wish I hadn't sold, frankly, but of the two, this is much more iconic. The para pistol, I don't think saw much real use, and for what it. As far as semi-automatics, it started off with the Mark IV Police Carbine. Essentially, it was the same as the Mark IV submachine gun, but it lacked the select fire. It was just safe semi. It still had an 8-inch barrel, a little under, and it still fired from an open bolt. The Mark VI, on the other hand, was the first to go to a closed bolt, and there was the 8-inch version. That's more Sterling's nomenclature than mine. And then the special 16-inch version here, manufactured for the U.S. market specifically. Numbers get bandied about, but around 6,000 semi-autos of all types were probably made, including the Mark 7. But also, only about 1,600 of these were sent to America at most. And most serial numbers you encounter are below 500. So, who knows the reality? So yeah, do you own one of these? Do you have one of the Wise Lights? I think Wise Light did a pretty good job, frankly. They copied this to a T. That's not to say they are perfect. We already talked about that. But, outside of the originals. And what's crazy is these did not sell for a ton of money, even though they were always kind of rare. They just weren't too known. Everyone knows the semi-automatic Uzi, which we've talked about a lot. And maybe it's just me liking the underdog. But, yeah. Then again, I just kind of like the British styling. And as we looked at in the bayonet video, long barrel notwithstanding, that is a working lug. You can put a bayonet on. So, been meaning to have this out for a very long time. Hope you enjoyed it. Don't put a whole lot of rounds through it, but gotta make sure it still works. So yeah, feel free to discuss the Wise Lights, or if you have a Preban, or if you have one of the Mark 7 Paras. I do kind of regret selling that one, but oh well. If you could, like, share, and subscribe, check us out on Patreon. And with that, we're gonna kind of get on with our weekend. This is Misha. Catch you very soon next time.